Back for another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast, joined again by my very Mexican-looking friend, Ryan Hassel, aka the Dojo Dietitian. If you're not watching the YouTube channel, you won't appreciate why he looks like a Mexican, even though that is a very racy comment. But Dojo, welcome back on.
Hey, thanks, Jordy. Thanks for having me back on.
Tell the people, why do you still keep this thing on top of your lips?
Yeah, look, some people love it, some people hate it, but it's kind of just there to polarize, and people that don't like it, I probably don't like them. So it's a good way to kind of filter mates.
That's true. That's true. You do you as well. It's all about empowerment. But today, one of the best topics to talk about, I think it's probably the most highly requested topic, and one that you, as a dietitian, as a nutritionist, anyone in the nutrition space, you spend a lot of time talking about this, and that is protein. And I think traditionally when people think of protein, we always think of Arnold Schwarzenegger and bodybuilders and putting on muscle, but there's a lot more that goes into protein, and understanding a few simple ins and outs of protein makes your decision about how you put it in your diet a lot easier. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Dojo Dietitian. Take it away. Tell the people everything they need to know about protein.
Sweet. Cheers, Jordy. For the guys that follow along with the visuals as well, I've got some slides here that will kind of make it a little bit easier, but we'll chat about protein today. I want to focus, like, protein is a super broad kind of topic, but for today, I'll just try to focus on like dietary protein. So protein that comes from the diet and how we can sort of like optimize that. So first we need to kind of understand what protein is. So protein isn't just like one thing, like it's a group of, like, there's thousands and thousands of different types of protein or proteins. So yeah, it's essentially a group of things, and proteins themselves are made up of these little building blocks called amino acids. And we'll get onto that a little bit more shortly, but depending on the amino acids that a protein is made out of, like, that'll kind of determine the shape, the structure, the function, all these different things about that protein. Dietary protein is an essential nutrient, and it's one of the three sort of macronutrients. So when you think of, like, as you said before, a lot of bodybuilding, like these sort of macronutrients are brought up a lot. So that's like your protein, carbs, and fats. And the macro side of that, so like the reason they're called macronutrients is because they provide energy for the body in terms of ATP. If you've listened to a couple about other podcasts, we've chatted about ATP and how that provides energy for things, you know, like muscle contraction, but basically everything in your body. So yeah, protein is one of these macronutrients, but it also has a lot of other functions in the body outside of just providing energy. So let's have a little bit more of a chat about them. But yeah, so here's a bit of a list on the screen. So the first one being growth and maintenance. So anytime the body does like any growing or changing, there's going to be protein involved in that, both in terms of like structural changes, but also in like the process of doing the building. Like protein kind of functions as a bit of a machine in the body, depending on like the type of the protein. But other things that it gets up to is it is one of the main things in your immune system. So when we hear about like, depending on your stance on vaccines and all that kind of thing, this might be a bit controversial, but when we talk about antibodies, antibodies are actually a type of protein. And then when you've got other like viral compounds coming into the body, those proteins will bind to them and kind of like get rid of them from our body. Other important things are acting as enzymes in metabolism and reactions in the body. So there's some reactions in our body that happen all by themselves really quickly, really easily, but others take a lot of time and actually require things to, I guess, like kickstart them. And proteins are one of the main ways that our body does that, to help, you know, break things down, build things up, and that kind of thing. The next one is maintenance of DNA. So as I said, some proteins can function as like little machines in our body. And one of the really important things that those do is to maintain our DNA. So making sure there's no sort of like mistranscriptions, like any sort of errors in the DNA, they can kind of go along and like clean them up. And that's really helpful in preventing things like, you know, like cancer and that kind of stuff. The next one is peptide hormones. So there's obviously a lot of different types of hormones in the body, like some of the more common ones you might have heard of, things like testosterone, estrogen. Those ones are more so like steroid based. So they're like based from fats, but there are hormones in the body that are built from protein. So these are peptide hormones. And that includes things like insulin, so involved in the metabolism of glucose and moving that into the cells as well. So kind of also important in terms of like carbohydrate metabolism, but that's probably a chat for another time. And then the last one is like transport molecules. So in our blood, certain things that for them to actually move throughout our body, some things can't just like sit in the blood. They need to be carried by molecules, and those molecules are going to be proteins that carry them around the body. All right, so we're chatting about dietary proteins. So it's kind of important to break down like where protein comes from in the diet. And so the main sources that people probably think of are animal proteins, but then obviously we've got other types of diets that are out there, especially plant-based, vegan, vegetarian diets that get their protein primarily from plant-based sources. So on the animal side, obviously that's things like red meats, poultry, fish, etc. But plant-based proteins are going to come more so from your nuts, legumes, beans, and then also some sort of processed foods like tofu and nutritional yeast and those kind of things. And then outside of like the food-based protein sources, we've also got things like supplements. So, protein powders, bars, and then also some food products that are fortified with more protein. So some pretty popular ones are things like protein yogurts and that. And this is one, Geordie, that I know we get asked a lot about, and that's the difference between animal versus protein. Animal versus plant protein, especially from an athlete point of view. And people kind of wonder, is it okay to be plant-based or vegan as an athlete? And so I'd like to kind of go into the differences between them and then how we can kind of overcome those limitations of the particular diets. Amino acids. So this is kind of the main sort of differentiating factor between the different types of protein and so kind of help to explain the difference between animal and plant-based proteins. But so as I mentioned, amino acids are kind of the building blocks of protein. So when we eat protein, we consume it through our diet, it's broken down into these little individual building blocks that are then absorbed into our bodies. And then we can use them, kind of combine them together to make the different proteins, things like muscle protein and that kind of thing, to be used in our body. Now, when it comes to amino acids, there's 20 in total, with 9 of them being essential. So essential meaning they have to come from the diet. We can't make them ourselves. The other ones, we can make them using bits and pieces of other molecules, but these 9, they have to come from our diet. So that's a really important thing to consider when we're talking about protein sources. Now, the way that a protein is structured or the types of amino acids that are used to make that protein is what we consider the amino acid profile of that protein. So that's one of the main 2 things that we would kind of look at when determining the quality of a protein source. So yeah, one being that amino acid profile and the other one being the bioavailability of the protein itself, or the protein like within that food, sorry. So to go a little bit more into the amino acid profile, as I mentioned, we've got the essential versus non-essential amino acids, and foods that are higher in the essential amino acids, meaning the a higher percentage of their total amino acid content is the essential ones. That's going to help us to more efficiently meet our targets, like our requirements for these essential amino acids. And one of the things that can also kind of go on here is that some foods, and this is going to be especially like plant-based food or plant-based protein sources, they can be high in some essential amino acids whilst also being low in other ones. So the total percentage might look good on paper, but they might still be missing some really key essential amino acids. And so if you get all of your protein from like one plant-based source, for example, you might be really high in like some amino acids and low in others. The second important consideration for protein quality is the bioavailability of the protein in that food. So the food might have like X amount of protein in it, so maybe like 10 to 20 grams, but the bioavailability tells us how much of that 10, 20 grams is actually going to be absorbed. And the main thing that affects that is something in the foods called anti-nutrients. So I mentioned briefly at the start of the podcast about macronutrients, and then we've also got things like micronutrients, like minerals and vitamins. And then there's a third category, which is anti-nutrients. So these are sort of like non-nutritious compounds that don't really add much in terms of benefit to the body. They more so just impact on our body's ability to absorb the other nutrients. And we'll run through some examples of that now. But essentially, there's two main ways that anti-nutrients affect our body's ability to absorb things. The first one being preventing uptake. So a good example of this is phytates. And these are found in like seeds, grains, nuts, and they will bind to particular nutrients, especially minerals. So this is one thing that can happen a lot, especially with like iron deficiencies and stuff. They'll bind to them and basically prevent us from being able to absorb them. And that also happens in some foods with protein. The second one is inhibiting enzymes. So we could do a bit more of a podcast on like the actual physiology of protein absorption, but it's like the basic thing to understand about it is that when we eat the protein and it's broken down into those little amino acid building blocks, part of that is done by like not just stomach acid and like all that digestive stuff. There's enzymes in there as well, like in our digestive system, that help to break down those molecules. Now, things like trypsin inhibitors, which is a compound that can come in some vegetable foods, these can actually inhibit the enzymes or slow down their ability to break down the proteins. And therefore, like by not being able to break down as much of it, we're not going to be able to absorb as much of the amino acids, if that makes sense. And it's not just amino acids and protein. This also impacts on the absorption of other macro compounds, so things like carbs and fats and that kind of thing. And now these inhibiting enzymes are found particularly in things like legumes and beans. Now, if you remember back to the slide when I was chatting about the types of protein sources, you'll notice that these are kind of like the protein, like the plant-based protein foods are things like legumes, beans, nuts, grains, and seeds. So this is something that's like really important to consider when you're thinking about using these foods to get protein from your diet. So that being said, like there's a couple of limitations there, right, around absorbing or getting protein from your diet from plant-based foods. So how do we get around that? And there's a few things that we can do to improve that the absorption of protein and get more protein in to be able to fuel ourselves adequately, especially for athletes, which are going to have higher protein requirements. So some of these strategies include things like just increasing the total amount of protein. So if you think like, just to give like a hypothetical, if one food has like, I don't know, 100 milligrams of a particular amino acid, that's an essential one, so we have to get it from our diet. So say it's like an animal-based food, you absorb most of that 100 milligrams. If it was a plant-based food, you might only absorb something like maybe 60 milligrams of that 100. So to increase that, you basically just, by increasing the total amount of that food, you'd be able to meet the requirements of the essential amino acids in the same way, just by consuming more food. The second one is to look for like matches between foods that complement the amino acid profiles. So if one particular plant-based food is really low in like one essential amino acid and another one is high in that same one, you can actually find strategies, and there are things that you can look up online around complementary protein sources where particular foods do have higher amounts of certain essential amino acids that will offset the deficiency in like another food. So like one common example is like beans and rice. They have really complementary proteins because the amino acids in beans will kind of offset the ones that are missing in rice and vice versa. And then the last one is to consume things that are fortified with essential amino acids. So by fortified, I just mean that they sort of like artificially add them in order to like increase the amount of essential amino acids to help meet those targets. So examples of that are things like protein powders, and then also some like cereals and stuff. They'll add some essential amino acids in there. So let's talk requirements. We've mentioned requirements a couple of times now, so good to kind of just know where they are. So for normal, like non-athlete people who aren't exercising heaps and aren't having a lot of like muscle protein breakdown and that kind of thing, your targets for protein are actually not going to be as high. So around 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram per day is adequate for most people. Now, for athletes, obviously, when you're training multiple times a day, you're getting breakdown of muscle tissue, you need to be resynthesizing it. Your goals might actually be centered around putting more muscle on. Therefore, the targets are going to be a bit higher. So around 1.4 to 2 seems to be a good sort of ratio, like per kilogram per day of protein, with the higher end sort of being more favorable. Like if the target is around like losing weight and you're trying to hold on to muscle, you might have to increase the amount of protein that's being consumed. And then that's sort of assuming a high quality protein, so like an animal source or like a fortified source. But if you're getting your protein primarily from a plant-based diet, your targets are then going to be a little bit higher, as I mentioned, to help offset that difference in essential amino acids. But it's not like a huge amount higher. So there's pretty good evidence that about 1.6 grams per kilogram on a plant-based diet should be enough to just sort of like bump up your protein enough to cover those deficiencies in certain essential aminos. And now timing. So there's a lot of like information out there like about anabolic windows and making sure your protein timing is good. The main thing to know about protein is that like the overall amount of protein you get in is the most important thing. So as long as you're ticking that box, you're going to be getting like most of the benefit of the protein. A few other things that you can do to help potentially optimize that a little bit further is to make sure you're distributing your protein evenly over the day. And it looks like every 3 to 4 hours seems to be a good sort of like timing to distribute that over. Now, in terms of like the anabolic window, like, you know, gym junkies that try and like smash their protein straight after a workout to try and get the most gains. That anabolic window actually lasts for about 24 hours after a workout. So you're synthesizing protein pretty efficiently for up to 24 hours. So it's not hugely important that you get the protein in straight after. However, if you are an athlete who is training a lot and you're trying to make sure you're optimizing your energy levels, then consuming it straight after a workout can help to improve glycogen synthesis. So that's more related to like carbs and that energy system. But so if you're an athlete that does really intense training sessions, multiple times a day, and you're trying to make sure you're optimizing your glycogen, then having protein, like just moderate amounts after a workout, can be really beneficial. And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover for protein for today, Geordie. Did you have any questions or anything that you think the viewers might be interested in hearing about?
Yeah. Well, we'll go through a few things. I think that a couple of things that pop up. Just cut the screen there, Dojo. I think the biggest one and the most obvious one is if we're talking about animal and plant-based protein, no matter which way you want to eat. Obviously, you went over some good points there. If you're eating plant-based, the bioavailability is a bit lower, and it's probably a good idea to do a number of things where you can increase the overall total amount of protein and then do the compatible matching the protein so you have complete proteins. The question I always get a lot of the time, I'd like you to go over, if there is an athlete or someone who's just training, is it better for their overall performance to choose one over the other? Or is it the fact that, you know, you just got to get this certain amount? Or where's the evidence right now with that?
I'd say the evidence doesn't really lean either direction. I'd say you could get really good performance out of both diets as long as you're hitting your targets. The main difference being for sports where you're kind of having to take into consideration your total energy intake for the day as well. So that's things like your weight category sports. There may be some differences because a lot of like plant-based protein sources will also be really high in things like carbs or fats, depending on, so like nuts versus like grains and that. So that's something else you have to consider. But you can definitely make it fit. I mean, it's just a difference of like more like a pure protein source. So let's say you had like a lean meat, then you could have that with some carbs, and then you've kind of got more food on your plate versus having a protein source that's got like everything in it, and then you might be restricted, or not restricted, but like limited in terms of like variety and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's good. The next thing that I'll go and we'll talk about this in depth is more on the supplement side. Something we didn't go over too much, but everyone will be asking about is BCAAs. Can you just give us a quick rundown of them and where they fit in all this?
Yeah. So BCAAs, it was like a bit of a fad a few years ago. And that's like these branch chain amino acids, right? So in terms of like muscle protein, and the whole like muscle protein synthesis system, it's been sort of identified that these BCAAs, or branch chain amino acids, are really important, particularly I think it's like leucine, for sort of like driving that process of facilitating muscle protein synthesis, which is like muscle growth and all of that kind of thing. So there was a lot of a theory around like, oh, well, we've got to have more of these branch chain amino acids to make sure that we're like optimizing protein building and all of that kind of stuff. The reality is, like, if you just have enough protein, as long as it has like the essential amino acids in it, you're going to be getting enough BCAAs through your diet that way. Like even through like protein powders, so like whey powders and that kind of thing, you'll be getting the BCAAs that way because you break the protein down into the BCAAs and absorb it anyway. So there's no real need to take the BCAAs by themselves. That being said, like if you're taking them as like an intra-workout supplement, or like really close to a workout, it's similar to like a high GI carb, in that like if you have the amino acids in like a powder form or whatever, you kind of bypass having to break it down. So there is the benefit of like, okay, you can absorb them faster. But in terms of like, do you need to have them in that form? No, you can get them from normal protein.
So is it almost to say that if you're taking a protein powder or an essential amino acid mix, do you really need to be taking BCAAs?
Yeah, no, probably not.
So let's break down protein powders. So a lot of people do use protein powders just out of convenience to get their protein in throughout the day, especially when we're talking mid-morning, afternoon, when they can't sit down and make a meal. Is it better? Can they still get everything they need, all these essential amino acids, whether they pick whey, or can they do pea protein or rice protein, or what's the best one for them to pick?
Look, from my understanding, the whey protein does seem to be it just has the highest percentage of essential amino acids that we were talking about before. So in terms of like efficiency in like meeting your targets, that's probably going to be like the better one to go for. But obviously, if you're plant-based, you can't have whey protein. So all of these other ones like pea proteins and that kind of stuff, they're going to be fortified with those essential amino acids. So you'll still get them all, and you'll get them in like a good enough quantity that it's going to work just about the same. So really, there's not going to be too much difference. It kind of just comes down to personal preference and sort of like what your, I guess, your views on like plant versus animal based protein is.
And the last one, something that's popular lately, essential amino acids. Is that essentially the same as the protein powder, say like a whey protein that guys would get in a sup store?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like if it's a protein, like if it's a supplement that is specifically essential amino acids, then it's going to have higher amounts of those essential amino acids. But whey protein and those other sort of like traditional protein powders and stuff, they already have like such a high amount of essential amino acids in them that it's like they do the job basically. Like you probably don't need these essential amino acids like by themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I always tell the clients, because I think just the way that the powders are made, you'll tend to get protein powders in more of those milky type of flavors and milky textures. So if you like things like strawberry, chocolate, vanilla, caramel, go buy a protein powder. But if you're more on the side where you like the fruity side of things, and like your raspberry lemonade, your grapes or oranges or whatever, and you like that as a flavoring, go buy an essential amino acid mix, because you're going to be at both of them are doing the same thing. As long as you're getting the correct amount of essential amino acids and you're getting all 9 of those amino acids, you're giving your body everything it needs to not only just give enough amino acids for the uptake and building of muscle, but to fuel your hormones, to fuel your red blood cells, to fuel your organ cells, everything else, as long as you've got those 9 essential amino acids.
Yeah, exactly.
So the last one is, we spoke about the anabolic window, and we spoke about, yes, it's probably not as important as what the muscle bodybuilding documentaries make you think, like you got to finish, do your last set and just run to your bag and mix up a shake. You do have a window for it. And again, if you're spacing it out every 3 hours, it's really important. Something that is important for athletes who are doing 2-a-days, even 3 sessions a day, when you've got to restore that glycogen. Can you just run off, just for people who are listening, the type of athletes or sports people that would need to consider that?
Yeah, so it's going to be more so people that are using glycogen for their workouts, and so glycogen is used up during the use of that anaerobic energy system. So that's sort of like your moderate to high intensity exercise. So athletes that kind of perform like higher intensity training sessions, so things like rugby, football, combat sports, all of those sort of things where you're burning up a fair bit of energy pretty quickly, muscle glycogen is going to be important there. In saying that though, like endurance sports will also, like you oxidize glycogen as part of that energy system as well. So like any athletes, it's probably more so going to be beneficial for people that are just training like multiple times a day, as long as it's a certain level of intensity. Like if you're going for 2 walks a day, it's probably not going to be like super important. But yeah, if you're doing multiple sessions a day and you don't really have the time to be synthesizing glycogen slowly, like you want to speed up that process and make sure you've got fuel for the next session, that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's not taking away anyone that does walks or does yoga or whatever in the morning. That's absolutely fine. There's probably just not a rush to get the protein and start smashing carbs. Absolutely have your carbs or your protein with your breakfast after, but by no means feel it's the first thing you have to run out the door and then get.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. I think that's everything we need to talk about when it comes to protein. If you guys at home are listening to this, any other questions that you have, feel free to shoot myself or Dojo a message. Dojo, anything else you want to finish on?
I think that covers everything. Thanks so much for having me on, Geordie.
All right. Until next time, any other topics you guys want to hear us talk about, then feel free to shoot us a message and we'll get straight to it. But until next time, thanks for listening.